Hello, everyone. My final project is titled Fire Sovereignty and Relational Health, Indigenous Fire Stewardship as a Determinant of Health. In this project, I developed an Indigenous determinants of health model centered on fire sovereignty and relational stewardship systems. The model was inspired primarily by Klamath River Jack's 1916 letter titled An Indian's View of Burning, along with modern ecological research on Indigenous fire stewardship. Indigenous health is also often discussed through conventional public health determinants like income, healthcare access, or education. But many Indigenous determinants frameworks emphasize that health is also relational. Relationships with land, food systems, stewardship responsibilities, culture, governance, and intergenerational knowledge all contribute to well-being. Colonialism disrupted many of these relationships through land dispossession, fire suppression, ecological disruption, and forced cultural change. These disruptions continue to influence Indigenous experiences with chronic diseases, ecological instability, and cultural disconnection today. A major inspiration for this model, as I said before, came from Klamath River Jack's 1916 letter, An Indian's View of Burning. In the letter, Jack described cultural burning as a form of stewardship that sustained acorn harvest, regenerated berry production, improved wildlife forage, reduced pests and disease, maintained open grasslands, and protected mature trees through low intensity fire. Importantly, Jack described fire not as destruction, but as reciprocal care for the land. One statement that stood out to me was, white man take care of what he plant and what he use, but he forget to fix mountain land for elk, bear, and deer. This phrase really is the core of this model because it captures the exact philosophical divide that this model is actually exploring. That is, that settler management focuses on ownership and production, while indigenous stewardship focuses on reciprocal management, maintenance of living systems. Jack was describing ecological relationships and management principles that modern fire ecology now supports, strongly supports. Modern ecological research, as I said, strongly supports many of these observations made by Jack. Ruse and colleagues studied indigenous fire stewardship in the Jemez Mountains and found that indigenous fire management produced smaller fires, lower intensity fires, resilient forest systems, and ultimately reduced catastrophic fire risks significantly. Their research demonstrated that indigenous communities actively shaped landscapes through cultural burning and stewardship practices over long periods of time. One quote from the study especially connects to this project. Fire adds richness to the land. That phrase captures the relational philosophy at the center of this model. Abrams, in his 2010 work, expands this discussion into Eastern oak systems. He argues that many forests historically assumed to be untouched wilderness were actually actively maintained through indigenous burning practices. And this actually encompasses pretty much all of North America. These fire managed systems supported oak regeneration, mass production, biodiversity, and wildlife habitat. Abrams also argues that modern fire suppression contributed to dense forests, ecological imbalance, and the decline of many fire-adapted ecosystems. Together, these studies, and there's many more, support the idea that Indigenous fire stewardship functioned as long-term ecological management rather than random burning. This is the fire sovereignty and relational health model that I developed for this project. At the center is fire sovereignty, which I define as the ability of Indigenous people to maintain authority, responsibility, and knowledge related to cultural burning practices on their traditional lands. The second ring represents ecological stewardship processes described by Klamath River Jack and supported by ecological research. And these include acorn sustainability, berry regeneration, wildlife habitat, pest reduction, low intensity fire, open grasslands, nutrients recycling, and all of this comes from this seasonal stewardship by the Indigenous people of that area. The outer ring represents Indigenous determinants of health, like food sovereignty, ecological resilience, cultural continuity. I always say that wrong. Intergenerational knowledge, the passing of knowledge, community well-being, self-determination, and sovereignty and governance. All of these are influenced by and influence those components of ecological stewardship and how the sovereignty and governance is going to impact berry regeneration through fire sovereignty. On the outside, and these are outside of this model, but they are what causes a lot of the problems, and that is this colonial fire suppression and disruption, because it breaks relationships, it increases vulnerability, it harms health, and that would be things like fire suppression, land dispossession, ecological imbalance, chronic diseases, and catastrophic fire. All of these are going to impact the Indigenous determinants of health, and they're ultimately going to impact the health of the ecosystems themselves, or vice versa, is, is how that's happening. Finally, the model is circular because Indigenous relational systems are cyclic and interconnected. Fire stewardship supports ecological systems, which support Indigenous determinants of health, while colonial suppression disrupts these relationships, as I said. I will say that this is a conceptual model developed by myself, but I used OpenAI ChatGPT image generation tools to create the image that you are seeing. This model suggests or indicates that Indigenous stewardship systems can also function as public health interventions. Cultural burning programs, Indigenous-led land stewardship, food sovereignty initiatives, ecological restoration, language transmission, and intergenerational teaching may all contribute to community well-being because they restore relationships among people, land, and stewardship responsibilities. In this framework, health is not only biomedical. Health also emerges through maintained relationships with ecosystems, culture, governance, and community. In conclusion, Indigenous fire stewardship maintained interconnected ecological and cultural systems for generations. Colonial fire suppression disrupted many of these systems and contributed to ecological imbalance and cultural disruption. Fire sovereignty, therefore, offers not only a framework for ecological restoration, but also a relational framework for understanding Indigenous health itself. Want to close with Klamath River Jack's final warning. White man, you know too late. He warned more than a century ago that suppressing fire would damage ecosystems and food systems. Today, many indigenous communities and ecological researchers are discovering and rediscovering the importance of cultural burning and relational stewardship. Thank you very much for your time.